Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming tonight for what promises to be a really interesting evening. I've known Peter now for 27 years, and from that I can tell you that he's a good storyteller, and I don't mean by that he's a liar, but that he can tell a good tale and give the account of it to each one of us. I'm sure for those who attended the last one he did concerning the house in Hamburg with moving walls, it was most engaging. And I'm sure tonight will be just as engaging. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Peter.
Thank you. That's very charitable, thank you. Do you know, if you then stopped at that point, Richard, and said, how long have we been acquainted? I might have had to think about that. Because as you get older, time seems to telescope, doesn't it? You know, you lose sort of sense of perspective. But thank you for your introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. I hope you're enjoying the refreshments. That lemon cake really was something else, Helen, so thank you for your efforts there. So, our theme this evening is Who Saves a Life? And the reason why I've chosen that title is going to become apparent fairly shortly. But you notice in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a little logo there for the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. And the presentation I gave last year about the house in Hamburg with the moving walls, where a certain individual lived who escaped the Holocaust and came to this country. And then I told the audience at the end that, in fact, it was my mother. I actually heard somebody on the front row whispering to their host, how does he know so much about this woman? It is as though it was his mother. And I thought, yes, little do you know. But my mother lived in Hamburg and born in 1927. It wasn't through the mechanism of the Kindertransport that we're going to look at this tonight, but nonetheless through the kindness of strangers and the grace of God that she escaped. So, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. Just a few words about this. Every year on the 27th of January, which was the date of the presentation that Richard alluded to, it's marked on the 27th of January, and the Holocaust Memorial Trust is a charity established and funded by the UK government to promote and support the Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK. We didn't sort of think about this meeting at that sort of time of year because that was just about the release of the One Life movie with Sir Anthony Hopkins, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and kind of felt those two would misalign. Representatives from 46 governments around the world met in Stockholm in the year 2000 just to consider how these events could best be marked, and that resulted in the Stockholm Declaration, which is where the Memorial Day comes from. And the purpose was, and remains, to remember the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, alongside millions of others who've been killed under Nazi persecution, and more recently in genocides in places like Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur, to mention but four. Oh, that the Holocaust in Germany was the only genocide in our recent times, but sadly, that cannot be said. So, any gifted Hebrew scholars here? Kol hamatzil nefesh achat, ke'elu hetzil olam umlo'o. I tormented the congregation this morning with this, saying, could anybody tell me what it meant? And two people whispered the answer. They're sat at the back. And it means? Correct. He that saves a life, it's though he saved the entire world. Now, who's here seen the movie Schindler's List? Yeah, everybody really? Towards the end of the movie, when all the people who Oskar Schindler has saved by virtue of employing them in his factory, ostensibly for the German war effort, but not much came out of his factories that actually worked. But in the confusion of war, that wasn't noted. On behalf of the Jews, they present to him a ring that's been made, and that's a replica of it there. And you can probably just see in the picture, there's an inscription inside the inside layer of the ring. And that has this verse that I just mentioned to you from the Talmud inside there, and they explained to him what it meant. And Liam Neeson plays the part of Oskar Schindler, and he's overcome with emotion at this point and drops the ring, and he finds it and picks it up and said, you know, and he starts fingering his brooch on its collar and said, with this I could have bought 2 more, and with this I could have bought another one, and I could have done more And the person who presents him with the ring stops him and says, "No, what you did was enough. What you did was enough." Oskar Schindler was responsible for saving well over 1,000 Polish Jews during the Holocaust. The Gestapo tormented him, but he found ways, usually by his own means, to placate them or to bribe them or to distract them or something like this, and so preserved the lives of all of those people. But our story tonight is not about Oskar Schindler, but it's how this Talmudic theme here applied in a different means by which some 10,000 children, mostly Jewish, not entirely, but mostly Jewish, were brought to the UK under a scheme that became known as the Kindertransport. Just pausing for a moment because page 2 and page 3 of my notes are in the wrong place. That wouldn't do, would it? So, the theme of one life was embodied into a movie that was released at the start of this year. Who's seen this movie, One Life? Yes. If you haven't seen it and you get the opportunity, I recommend you do. And if you look at the top, it says, "Save one life, save the world." So that resonates with this same Talmudic theme from the Jewish scriptures, that saving one life has a greater implication than that life alone. And you see there the face of Sir Anthony Hopkins. And he plays the part of the older Nicholas Winton in the movie. And the team that was led by Nicholas Winton was responsible for saving 669 children on transports that came from Prague right up to the outbreak of the Second World War. But there's a slight aside here that you may or may not know, and I'd like to share with you. Here you see, or you will, there is Nicholas Winton's daughter, Barbara Winton, and she agreed to the movie being made and releasing all of the archive material in his memoirs and sort of supporting the creating of the movie on a condition. And the condition was that Sir Anthony Hopkins be asked to play her father. Only if he accepted would she agree to its production. He did. But sadly, Barbara Winton died before the release of the movie. Although Sir Nicholas Winton lived to 106. 106, that's unimaginable, isn't it? She died somewhat younger. He said in making the movie he was deeply moved. And he does play the part extremely well. That's the real Nicholas Winton over on the right there. Now then, in this picture you see one of a large collection of very rare color images taken by Hitler's personal photographer, I should say, Hugo Jäger. And behind all the choreography and the aesthetics and all of this kind of thing, the Nazi movement, which began with Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933, was far more than a political movement. It was a very contorted ideology that was based on the eugenic principle that you could create a master race, the Aryan race, even though Hitler was not one such. Paradox there. And as a consequence of this, tens of thousands of Jews left the country in the face of growing persecution. The initial objective was to try and cause them to leave, just leave the country. But that quickly became slower as it became more and more difficult to obtain a visa. Now, in response to this, the UK President Franklin Roosevelt, he proposed a conference. The US President Franklin Roosevelt. He proposed a conference to find countries willing to offer refuge to Jews stranded in Nazi Germany. So modern conferences where lots of noble things are said and not much actually happens is not a modern phenomenon, because they met in July 1938 in the French resort of Evian-les-Bains, representatives of 32 nations met for 10 days. Now you can see here Myron C. Taylor. He was a businessman and a close friend of Roosevelt, but not a high-ranking diplomat. He didn't send a Secretary of State or anybody like that. He sent a relatively modest representative. And there were grand proclamations, but little came of it. Most countries, including the US and the UK, they declined. They found reasons why that they were unwilling to admit new immigrants. Dominican Republic, incidentally, a tiny country, was the only one out of all of those nations that readily offered to take people. So that was the situation. Because there are those who like to portray these stories as evidence of the magnanimity of the British nation and all of this kind of thing. The truth was actually rather different. And it was a triumph of individuals who were highly motivated and whose vision for what their conscience, which overcame all the bureaucracy. And I'm going to share with you one or two of those things this evening. Now, in amongst all of this, the pace of persecution and difficulty in Germany was growing, and it reached its pre-war peak in a brutal reprisal by the Nazis for the killing of a Polish Jew of one of their diplomats in Paris. Ironically, the diplomat he killed was under investigation by the Gestapo for anti-Nazi sentiment. But the Polish Jew concerned, he bought a gun and he shot this man and killed him as a consequence of what he'd seen happening in the occupied territories. Hundreds of synagogues. That was the date of it, Kristallnacht. And Kristallnacht means crystal night, and the name comes from the fact that so many properties were ransacked. The streets were littered with shards of glass, and so it was like crystal coating of the streets. So Kristallnacht came from the ransacking of these properties. The 267 synagogues destroyed. 7,000 businesses were damaged. Hundreds, we don't know how many, were killed, and at least 30,000 Jewish men were taken and incarcerated. It was a brutal reprisal. Historians view Kristallnacht as the prelude to what became known as the Endlösung, or the final solution, the murder of 6 million Jews and other minorities during the Holocaust. Now, in response to all of this, the British Home Secretary at the time agreed to speed up the immigration process. I pause slightly. When you think of the current issue with post office sub-postmasters, they're trying to accelerate their compensation. You think, these politicians don't understand that word like I do. When politicians offer to speed things up, that means moving from an almost glacial pace to slow. And it was no different in these days. But they agreed they would issue documents based on group lists rather than individual applications, and that was to prove hugely significant for reasons that I'm going to explain in a moment. But there were conditions. Both Jewish and non-Jewish organizations had to fund the operation, and they had to ensure none of the refugees became a financial burden on the public. Every child had to have a guarantee of £50 to effect their eventual re-emigration. £50. Any idea what that would be in today's money? £4,200 or thereabouts. You might do some crowdfunding to get one person or something like that. 10,000 children? £4,200? That's a monumental sum of money. But it was raised. It was raised. But it didn't serve their eventual re-immigration because the majority of their parents perished. It was assumed at the time the danger was temporary and the children would go home. So on the 25th of November, after discussion in the House of Commons, British citizens heard an appeal on the BBC Home Service for foster homes. Good old BBC. And there were soon at least 500 offers. And the refugee children's movement started visiting potential foster homes. And it wasn't a requirement that Jewish refugee children be housed in Jewish families or homes. So that's interesting in itself. And the first Kindertransport departed Berlin on the 1st of December 1938, and the first from Vienna on the 10th of December in the same year. Interestingly, The ship at the top there is the SS Prague, and one of the other ships was the SS Vienna, which I find ironic given that those were cities that were involved in the evacuation. And here is the SS Prague arriving in Harwich. And if you ever go to Harwich, the Parkston Quay, you'll see that plaque there with all the details on it. And in March 1939, after the German army entered Czechoslovakia, transports from Prague were organized. Trains of expelled German Jewish children in Poland were also arranged in the spring and later parts of 1939. The last group of children from Germany departed on the 1st of September 1939, the day the German army invaded Poland, provoking Great Britain, France, and other countries to declare war. The last known Kindertransport of any kind left the Netherlands on the 14th of May 1940, carrying 74 children, which was the day the Dutch army surrendered to Germany. And on the bottom picture, you can see the Bodegraven ship bringing those children. This was organized by an individual you may not have heard of. You've heard of Sir Nicholas Winton, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about Gertrude Wismuller-Meyer. And she also organized that first transport from Vienna I spoke to you in a moment. And there is the redoubtable Gertrude Wismuller-Meyer. It's worth dwelling on the efforts of this redoubtable lady. When I wrote that, I thought I better check that adjective's right. And redoubtable is definitely the right description of this remarkable lady. She was a Dutch resistance fighter and brought Jewish children and adults to safety before and during the Second World War. She was a social worker and even in her day a vigorous campaigner for women's rights. And after the events of Kristallnacht, she traveled to Germany to bring family members of Jewish acquaintance to safety, or relative safety we can say, in the Netherlands. It didn't prove to be in the longer term, but in the short term. On one occasion, we're told, she smuggled a Yiddish-speaking Polish boy through the border within her skirts. Can you imagine that? She must have had very capacious skirts. Or he was a very small boy. I don't know. She was requested in December 1938 by the British to travel to Vienna to meet somebody under the name of Dr. Eichner. But that actually was a pseudonym. His name was actually Dr. Eichner. His name was actually Adolf Eichmann. And if you know anything about the history of the war, he was one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. That's quite something, going to meet somebody like him. Okay, but she did. She went and she was asked to discuss. This is all she was asked to do, to discuss the possibility. That was her sole remit, to discuss the possibility of Jewish children being allowed to leave Vienna. She went to see the individual who proved to be Eichmann, and he was very cynical and uncooperative. But I've already told you, she was a very determined lady. She had two nicknames. One of them was Tante Truus. Truus is like for Gertrude, so that was Auntie Truus, okay? The other one, all you good Dutch speakers here, is that. That's the Dutch for steamroller. Okay? And I think it's appropriate, because she simply would not be put off. So Eichmann said, okay. Well, was that a biblical story where the judge gives in to the woman who keeps pestering him? He said, okay, I give you permission to remove 600 children from Vienna, providing you take them all and you do it this Saturday. He obviously thought, I'll set her an impossible task, and then she'll fail, and that'll be the end of that. But he hadn't bargained with the Sturmwalds, and she made it happen. You can imagine the consternation when 600 children, well, 500 children, because 100 remained in the Netherlands, but 500 children arrived at Liverpool Street in London, having come from the train from Harwich. You were supposed to talk to the man, not bring the children back with you. But she did. The program of Kindertransport was brought to an end with the start of the Second World War, by which time some 10,000 children had been brought to this country under these schemes. The term Kindertransport generally refers to refugee children who came unaccompanied to this country. But smaller numbers were taken in by other countries, notably Sweden. And after the war ended, many of the children stayed in this country or emigrated to the newly formed state of Israel, America, Canada, or Australia. Most of the children had been orphaned since leaving their homes because they lost their families, either in the ghettos or in the camps they themselves had escaped. Images like this depict happy children involved in some kind of excursion. This is a genuine picture from the Kindertransport, okay? But I suspect has been orchestrated and staged to show a sort of positive view. The reality was rather different. Astonishingly, Jewish parents agreed to allow their children to leave. They perhaps realized it was better for their children to leave and survive than to remain with the peril that was ensuing. But as a parent, I try and imagine what that must feel like. To entrust your children this monumental journey and to the mercy of strangers. But they did. And this is where the group application bit came in. If you've seen the movie One Life, the young Nicholas Winton meets a rabbi in Prague. And of course, they're very, very reluctant to release lists because the lists make the individuals vulnerable. But eventually, he persuades them. And so they have the lists and they make all the preparations so the children can leave and they produce the paperwork and so on and so forth. It was an astonishing effort. With just one small case and a token sum of money, children left behind all that was familiar, placing their trust in strangers. On arrival in Harwich, they were brought to London Liverpool Street, where there's memorials to exist in the Devon if you go there. They were introduced to foster parents or brought temporarily to places like Dover Court holiday camp you can see here. Again, I suspect that's a little bit staged. Hundreds of foster homes through the UK opened their doors to child refugees, and they did their best to give them love and reassurance. Here's a young Jewish boy being introduced to the delights of English afternoon tea. Many were too young fully to understand what was happening, but it was an exhausting process for them all. So that's probably a more realistic picture. Now, a presentation of this nature would be incomplete without mention of Sir Nicholas Winton, whose activities in organizing the rescue of 669 children, mostly Jewish, from Prague, remained largely unrecognized for some 50 years. He was born to Jewish parents. Winton was not his original family name. And they had come to Britain. They'd immigrated in the early 1900s, and they lived in Hampstead in London. He studied at the newly opened Stowe School and worked in banking in various European countries, ending up as a stockbroker in London. And that's where the One Life movie picks up his career. What you might not know, beyond all of this, that Nicholas Winton was an outstanding fencer. There's different types of swords they use in fencing, and I suppose I really should have checked what they are. But foil and épée, I think. He was gifted in both of those things. And he was to represent Britain in the 1938 Olympics. But as I'm sure you're aware, with the outbreak of war, or the likelihood of war, that didn't happen. There is still such a thing as the Winton Fencing Cup. It's a competition that still exists. It's amazing the things you learn when you research these topics, isn't it? You won't learn that by seeing the movie, by the way. You've got to go to Wikipedia for that. He visited Prague in December 1938 at the invitation of friends who were working there, and he witnessed firsthand the suffering of Jews who'd been displaced there. Their conditions were primal. And if you see the movie, they accurately recreate. He was treated with great distrust by the people there. They didn't know who to trust, so they distrusted everyone. So his first challenge was to gain the trust of the people concerned. And he did that. He was determined to do something. He would not let the matter rest. And he coordinated with others what has become known as the Czech Kindertransport. A number of trains left, comprising in total 669 children, as we've said before. There was a final train that was due to leave Prague on the 1st of September 1939, but that was unable to depart because of the German invasion of Poland that day, and the Second World War had begun. Of the 250 children due to leave on that train, it is only known that 2 survived the war. And it tormented Nicholas Winton subsequently that train didn't get out. It was even loaded and they were disembarked. He didn't treat his endeavors with secrecy. He just genuinely thought that what he'd done was not extraordinary. I find that extraordinary in itself. The sheer effort of persuading bureaucrats to cooperate and coordinating all the processes and making sure the children were cared for and supervised and didn't get lost en route. I mean, if you think about the safeguarding implications under modern criteria of shifting all those children by train across Europe, you'd find that raft to bureaucracy would stop you doing anything. But they were so determined to do this. And it was a whole team that did it, not him on his own. And he felt, some 50 years after the event, that he ought to place the material from his experiences in some Holocaust museum or maybe some archive where people could make use of that. The local newspaper where he lived wasn't interested. They were subsequently, and he turned them away. The movie shows that quite well. But somebody saw the paperwork and thought, now that's interesting. And the end result was, he was invited to become part of the audience on a TV show that dates me, That's Life, with Esther Rantzen, herself a Jew. It was easy tracing Esther Rantzen's lineage because Rantzen was not a common surname, but she's Jewish. And she used to lead a program called That's Life. And if you see the movie One Life, they recreate this episode. But I'd like to show you the original 1988, just a little snippet out of it, okay? And if the technology will work for me, then I'll do it for you.
All the letters. But back here is the list of all the children. This is Vera Diamant, now Vera Gissing. We did find her name on his list. Vera Gissing is with us here tonight. Hello, Vera. And I should tell you that you are actually sitting next to Nicholas Winton. Hello.
And it was just so wonderful, so terribly, terribly touching.
Is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
was another episode of That's Life, because the public response to this, I watched that episode when it was first broadcast, being largely unaware, despite my family ancestry, largely unaware of the story. They had another episode, I think a week later or very soon, and this time there was no mystery about it because Winton knew what to expect. But when they got to the point where they asked who owed their life to him, they then asked who was descended, and the remainder of the audience stood up. The 669 children that his team brought back yielded thousands of descendants. Thousands of descendants. He who saves one life, it is as though he saves the world entire. Nicholas Winton was an inspiration to many people all around the world. He humbly insisted that anyone would have done the same. He's on record as saying that. But they didn't. Most people stood by. And I think what challenges me personally is that my life serves a purpose and is of benefit to those round about me. We live in a very selfish age where what you can have and what you can gain is what matters. But it's a wonderfully anarchic thing in a selfish society to be motivated for the benefit of others. And that was his motivation. And I want to draw our proceedings to a close in a few moments. But I'd like to consider some words that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 25. Come, he said, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And the audience, the Jewish audience, said, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And his response, I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. Whatever you did for these children you brought out, and the others, adults too. Whatever you did for the least of my brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And as Easter approaches, I invite you not only to consider Jesus' death and resurrection, by which a new relationship with God has been enabled, but also how we can be agents of his grace and kindness in the way we meet the needs of those around about us. Kol hamatzil nefesh achat, ke'elu hetzil olam umlo'o. He who saves a life, it is as though he saved the entire world. I want to thank you for coming this evening. And I'll leave the final words of this presentation to Moses' brother Aaron, who was instructed by God, via Moses, to say this. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.
Peter did say to me this morning that he's happy to answer any questions if anyone has anything further to ask about the presentation, the content of it, although he did say, I'm not an expert on this. But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask at this moment.
That's very kind, Erica. I'll preempt one question, if I may. It's a bit mischievous, isn't it, saying you'll take questions and then you ask the questions as well. Frequently, I've been asked in professional circles, well, your story of your own life and your mother is remarkable, and the recounting of these episodes remarkable too. But what kind of a God permits 6 million of his people to suffer a fate such as this? That's a fair question. Maybe you're thinking it, but you didn't want to ask it. And my response to that, I don't know the answer, but my response is, since the start of time, men have been cruel to one another. The extent of the cruelty varies, and the mechanisms they contrive to exercise that cruelty become ever more sophisticated and destructive. But we've been given a choice to do what is right or do what is wrong, or to fail to do what is right or fail to avoid doing what's wrong. And I've come to realize that if I trust my life to God and allow him with my best efforts to lead where I go, then I will be of best use to him. I don't know why that atrocity occurred. I don't know why my mother was spared. But I'll tell you this. I was once at the East Riding of Yorkshire College in Bridlington. I think I've been invited to give a talk on democracy or something brutally interesting like that. And I can't remember how it came up, but one young man, I can see him now in his red hoodie, really ventilated his views about immigration. Really, it was quite brutal. And when he'd finished, I said, well, I'm glad you feel able to express your views. Can I respond? And he said, yes. I said, if your views had been taken to a conclusion, my mother would not have escaped Hamburg. She would have ended up in Auschwitz or Mauthausen or somewhere. You might be sitting here, young man, learning about turbochargers on your motor vehicle engineering course. I was happier to talk to them about that than I was democracy, because I understand turbochargers. But it wouldn't be me stood here, because my destiny would have been truncated in all that episode. And this young man, he just folded. He just said, I'm so sorry. He said, I didn't think. I said, don't apologize. I'm glad you felt able to speak. It's the didn't think bit that I'd like you to bear in mind. We live in a country where you can express your views, but think about the consequences. Many is the occasion I'd suck the words back out of the air if I could, when I realized I said something I shouldn't, is the honest truth. But I live life with a certain humility, because my destiny was preserved, and many of these descendants the same. But Erica, thank you.
So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.